I'll just kick things off by saying, Lauren, thank you so much for agreeing to give us some of your time this January Wednesday morning and agreeing to come on the show. Show number 80, I should say. So nice. Very excited to reach that nice round number for my OCD. Mm-hmm. But thank you for joining us this morning. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
And Lauren, let's kick things off by, and again, I know your journey, your experiences in your professional life has been really interesting and really varied. And I think it would be great to give our listeners a real kind of flavor of you over the course of the next sort of 20 minutes or so. Touching upon the role that kind of corporate ethics, responsible practice and sustainability has played in, you doing what you've done so far in your career. Start wherever you like, childhood, schooling, or into early professional life, but just give our listeners a flavor of you.
Yeah, sure. So I guess we'll start from uni. So I went to Newcastle Uni. I did international business management. And when I finished, the only thing that I knew I wanted to do was work in food and beverage. So got onto a corporate catering.
So I'm going to interrupt you immediately. Why? What was it about food and beverage that?
Well, who doesn't love food and beverage?
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. Okay.
I also I did Spanish as part of that course, and the Spanish just was not strong enough to do anything with it. So I was limited to some extent. But yeah, no, love food and beverage, and always have. So got a job in corporate catering. Did like a graduate scheme with a brilliant company called Baxter Story, and at the end of that, moved into a company doing new concept mobilization. So essentially what we do is we build restaurants and cafes in travel specific locations. Super fun job, working across multiple different teams, from the kitchen team to marketing to commercial, etc. And then managed to get a job working in the spirits industry, which at the time I was mid-20s. So an amazing job to have when you're kind of mid-20s. And kind of, got my teeth stuck into that. But about 2.5 years into the job, I think it was, me and my partner at the time took a 3-month sabbatical. And I know that we spoke about this before, but it sounds like one of those quite douchey things that people say where like, I found myself when I was in like India or Bali, whatever. But it kind of was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. So we were in, where were we? We were in Sri Lanka. And I've never seen in real life before landfill site.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of chuck stuff in the bin and you don't really think too much about it. We're not connected enough in the UK, I think, to where our rubbish goes. So in Sri Lanka, I saw for the first time a huge landfill site. And it's such a polar opposite to the reason why you would go to somewhere like Sri Lanka. You're going for like the beautiful landscape, the amazing animals, the culture, etc. So it was quite a shock. And then there was a kind of key thing that happened to me once when we were on a beach, and there were these huge turtles that were swimming right up to the edge of the beach, and people were going into the water and having a close look at them and stuff. And we were sunbathing, and this guy was smoking a cigarette on the edge of the beach, which I've got a bit of an issue with anyway. And he just chucked the cigarette into the water. And these, like inches away from where this huge turtle was. And actually, weirdly, I was thinking about this the other day, about 5 or 6 years before that, I randomly took myself away and did some conservation work with turtles, leatherback turtles in the Caribbean. And so I have a real affinity with that sort of animal, and like I know how beautiful they are and how endangered that species is. And so it really bothered me. So it was this like really tall Russian man, and I'm 5'1" for reference. And so this like gobby like Mancunian went up to him and kind of said, "Excuse me, can you pick up your cigarette, please?" And obviously he didn't speak English. I don't speak Russian, so there's a lot of miming. And he did eventually pick up his cigarette when he put it in the bin. But it was, it really sat with me, that those two things that we saw in Sri Lanka really sat with me. And my role at the time was working in the marketing team. one of our key jobs is to produce point of sale items. So for anyone who doesn't know, point of sale items are anything from like a menu that you might see in a bar through to like an ice bucket that you might have like bottle to table service if you go to a nightclub or whatever. And we would order, and I think the companies still do order, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of these items that get distributed globally. So when I got back, I kind of raised this with my manager's manager, and I was like, where's this stuff coming from? China is the answer. And I'm a bit like a dog with a bone. I have been described like this by previous managers in annual reviews before, but I just wanted to find out more information. So I spoke to like the production teams and manufacturers. I was like, where's this stuff coming from? There's only so much information they can give as well, because I think actually they're not even 100% sure of the end journey. So I then carried on trying to get the bone and got in touch with our global sustainability team, who actually aren't the kind of the CSR side of things, so the comms out to customers, and flagged that I felt that in our company there was a massive disconnect between what we do when we place an order of, say, 40,000 ice buckets and the understanding of where that ice buckets come from and the impact that it's had on people and planet. So anyway, somehow she went along with what I was saying, and we managed to get some budget to brief an agency, an amazing storytelling agency in the States, to essentially create an internal video, which we were going to share with all of our marketing teams and beyond, to really clearly illustrate from when you press go on an order of 40,000 ice buckets in head office, from the very start of the journey over in China, or even like an oil rig essentially in the middle of the sea, what are we asking for? What are we demanding from people and planet in order to get those ice buckets back to our Schweffi nightclub in London? So we created this amazing story. It was super impactful. It's kind of like a mini, I wanted to create like a mini kind of cowspiracy, seaspiracy sort of thing that people would watch. And yeah, it's going to be sticky. Yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable because we're all responsible for what we're seeing here. But ultimately, it would drive the awareness, which I think is super important from a transparency perspective, to then set an agenda in terms of how we change that going forward. So anyway, amazing agency, amazing storytellers, had this incredible brief. And we had one more hurdle to get past before we went into production, and it was our communication, someone high up in communication. Won't be naming names or job titles. And anyway, the agency presented. I was on the call, and at the end of the call, the guy just leant back in his chair, crossed his arms, and he went, Lauren, he was laughing, and he was like, Lauren, you have got no idea. And essentially, just put down the whole thing, just put it in the bin, and was like, we can't do this. It's too disruptive. We'll upset too many people. You know, you don't understand how the business works, la, 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 la. Anyway, I had to jump onto a meeting straight after that. And then I got an email through straight away from the agency, who were external to the company. And they said, can you just jump on a call really quickly? So I cancelled the meeting that I was in, joined the call. And they were like, we are so sorry that you've been spoken to like that. They were like, we have never heard anyone be spoken to with such disrespect. Like, what you're doing is super important. And it was really refreshing to hear that, because I think sometimes if you're working in a corporate environment and you get told no from someone who is seen to have the right ideas about how things should operate, if they say no, you kind of just think, oh right, yeah, okay, well that's wrong, that must be wrong then, what I'm doing. So it was so nice, and it gave me like a real fire to carry on with, not this particular avenue because I was blocked in my current organization, but just a fire. So within that company,
Lauren, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to acknowledge the role that that agency played then, because that's wonderful that they acknowledge that and proactively, you know, went above and beyond to let you know, so that, you know, that could inspire you to do what you did next. I know you've already acknowledged it. I just think that's people going out of their way to do something they don't need to do because it's for the right thing to do.
Yeah.
That's super compelling. Sorry, you were in full flight.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And like the other thing, which I think is probably quite important to add, and this is not coming from like a feministy sort of thing, but maybe is a little bit, is those were three guys, right? And the guy
Mm.
and the person who'd blocked this for me in my existing company was a guy. The the CSR team were all females. So up until that point, like an empathy for what I was trying to do was coming from quite like female representatives in the business, and I got blocked from a guy, so it felt like this like feminist, like, oh, you're not,
E-
you're thinking I'm
Even
like an emotional woman, or I don't know, but
well, even the language that you use to describe the response,
yeah,
Lauren, it rings true to a fairly archaic. And I was thinking, I mean, I have to, my mind certainly jumped to a male colleague at that point. So I can really understand. And how you're in your mid to late 20s at
mid
this
to late
point.
20s, yeah,
Like, for you to have yes, the agency played the part, but for you to have the resolve to obviously go on and do what you do next and not allow that experience to sort of tread on you. What's the word?
yeah.
Downtread you, significantly is great. It's great that that's, not what happened afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. It lit a fire in my belly, that's for sure.
Mm.
So I was parts of various, like, I guess, LinkedIn groups and following different things, and the UN started a project, which I would imagine they still do, which is, it's called something like the Young Sustainable Innovators Program. And if you're under the age of 30, I think it was, and you work for a big corporate, you can bring to this kind of project group, which I think was run over about 6 weeks, an issue that you've got around sustainable transition. So there were people there from ASOS, from Vodafone. I nominated our company, and I went with one other person to kind of bring up an issue that I felt, which was that we from a marketing materials perspective, we weren't clear on what our environmental impact was. So, we track carbon emissions from producing spirits and bottling, which is definitely the biggest side of the business, right? I'm not discounting that, but there's also a huge impact that we're making from our marketing materials globally. Massive business.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I took it to that project group, and you work with lots of different people, and essentially you try and create a solution that you can then embed back in the business. That's how the program works. So we developed a way of like a version of a life cycle assessment for each of our marketing materials. I then took it back and presented it to the VP of sustainability, who was looking after the spirits packaging side of things. Definitely the where the priority should be. Mm-hmm. And I was like, look, we want to do this with marketing materials. We're going to need some input from your team, because there's like logistics involved and some packaging and bits and pieces that he also worked with from a bottling perspective. And he just shot it down. And I was on a team. This is now a different guy. I was on a team call with him, and I was like, look, it's really important. Like, we had some stats about in the UK alone, in one particular brand, we'd produced enough single-use plastic that's the same size as a full-size male blue whale in 1 year with one brand. So I was like, it's huge, and it's just getting chucked in landfill like every single year. We're generating new stuff. And I probably did get a bit fiery about it, but it's kind of, I think it's worthwhile getting fiery about. It's such an important thing to talk about. And he just told me to time out. So he literally was like, time out. And I was like, anyway, the fire was well and truly lit. So
and Lauren, sorry to interrupt you, but what was, I mean, again, the language that's been used, you've been through this once, you're now going through it again.
Yeah.
And you're being spoken to in this sort of way. But what was the justification from that colleague for why this initiative, the life cycle assessment of marketing materials, wasn't something to look into?
Well, it's twofold. And the first one is true, right? So the main purpose of the business is to produce spirits and bottle it. And that's the main impact that the business has. So in terms of priority and where he needs to dedicate resource, definitely needs to go to the bigger inside the business.
Mhm.
What was infuriating is that he was completely discounting any need at any stage to address the marketing side of things. And I think another reason why the business didn't put focus on that is that from an external customer perspective, no one's even talking about this stuff at the minute. So customers are conscious of carbon emissions due to bottles, and, you know, big brands are innovating and having like spirits in like cardboard and stuff now.
Yeah.
Um, but customers aren't thinking about the ice bucket that they get when they go to a nightclub, or the menu that they're looking at on the table. They're not putting two together. I don't think I would, obviously, but like I think your general consumer isn't bothered about those sorts of things. So from a business perspective, in terms of tracking impact, that isn't important because the customer doesn't care.
But Lauren, and I will bow to your obviously to your knowledge on this, but just playing like, well, maybe a naive point, but doesn't that make it like a massive opportunity to be the lead and to say, well,
Yeah.
we're gonna be the ones that are gonna highlight this issue, and we're gonna be the ones that are the leaders and the pioneers in addressing it. It's not a particularly ambitious viewpoint, is it?
No, but I think you find with corporates, and I'm sure we'll come on to it a bit later, but it generally is short-term reactive stuff. So it's responding to consumer demand, it's responding to what's a hot topic at the current issue, what do they have to do from a policy or regulation perspective. This sort of stuff's is kind of sitting under the radar at the minute, which you know, I get it. You know, businesses are limited in their resource and their funding, etc. They have to pick and choose, but it still doesn't sit well with me.
So you're sat there having had your second go at raising a really worthwhile and important sustainability initiative within the organization. What you mentioned that, I mean, we've gone from a sort of a burning ember to a fully fledged bonfire, I imagine, at this point, in terms of what's in your belly. So what happens next?
So I think where were we timing wise? This is post-COVID now. So probably like 2021. So coming out of COVID, the world is starting to reawaken again, etc., etc. Things are starting to go back to normality. And I just felt like nobody was taking me seriously. So I thought the only way that people will start to take me seriously if I had formal education in this sort of space, but also just educate myself more on what it takes to drive sustainable transition in companies, particularly corporates. That's all of my career history to date has been. So I did a couple of online courses. I did like a Harvard Business School one, which was super interesting about sustainable transition, sustainable change. I did a couple of free bits and bobs, and then I was like, no, I want to do a proper master's. So I applied for Energy, Society and Sustainability at Edinburgh Uni. Couple of reasons why I chose Edinburgh. So Scotland is very progressive in terms of renewable energy and policy change, etc., etc. So from that perspective, it's a strong country, I guess, to base yourself in to do a study like this. Edinburgh Uni, obviously, fantastic university. Also, that course allowed me to do it part-time alongside full-time work. And in order to fund it, I needed to still be having income from a job to do so. So there are lots of reasons why I chose that course. The other thing with that course is it tied in both social and environmental impact. So the social impact stuff was stuff that I wasn't very close to. It was more about carbon emissions or environmental impact, but never really knew much about the social side of things. So 2 years ago, started that and graduated this November, and it's been incredible. So not only has it meant that I've now relocated to Edinburgh because I think it's the best place in the world, but also what I learned from that course was just amazing. Learned so much about fuel poverty and really thinking about, if you look at things like renewable energy, just to give like an example, you know, it's perceived as something which is great and it's going to save us from fossil fuel issues, etc. But there are also so many issues that sit around renewables, so lithium mines in the desert, the impact that has on biodiversity and kind of indigenous communities around there. And no solution is perfect. I don't think there's going to be a golden bullet that just like solves everything, but I think it's really important to have as much clarity and share as much transparency as possible in any sort of sustainable change. That's kind of, I guess, one of the key things that I took from that.
Here, Lauren. I couldn't concur with that statement more. But and the way you've described your career has been, yeah, you can really see those kind of moments of inspiration and motivation and the burning of those fires in you. I want to ask you about your experience now. You going back to education and higher education and doing your masters. Do you feel like you've really now found your calling? Is it been a real like awakening in terms of alignment with your own personal values and passions, with, you know, a greater understanding and education in an area that really matters to you? Is that a fair synopsis of where you find yourself now?
I actually think I'm at the beginning of turning down a new route on a crossroads, is probably how I would describe it. I care a lot about people and planet and fairness, and there's a lot of unfairness going on, which I think is the fire that burns. I think that's kind of the thing that sets me off and gets me emotional and passionate about stuff. I'm also trying to hone in on exactly what my personal skill set is. So essentially getting shit done, I would say, is like a real skill set. And anyone who knows me would probably agree with that. So the change, the sustainable change, sustainable transition, I think it's something in that supporting people, having a voice about it as well, because I'm not afraid to say what I think needs to be said. I don't like to play the political game, which is hard because I've always been in corporate and you have to play the political game to some extent. But yeah, I would say I'm on the start of a journey to hone in on exactly what it is that I want to do.
Well, I would say from my limited experience, but, you know, having had, I think, yeah, as I mentioned, your show 80, so having had a few conversations with a few people about sustainability, the sort of sustainable transition, as you alluded to it, we need some people that are both prepared to call a spade and get shit done. And I think that would be a really good synopsis of what we're looking for. So, Lauren, that was absolutely fantastic. One last question about you and your career, and it kind of aligns perfectly with what you just said. Can you get out your magic ball for me and think about the end of your career? What do you want to be able to say about what you did with your career and your time at the end?
It'd have to be a lasting change, so something that goes past me. I'd like to really have drawn awareness to key things that are perhaps sitting under the radar at the minute. I think the transparency thing is like really key. So if there's anything that I could do over the next however many years to formally ensure that transparency is out there, maybe that's it. I guess set new standards around transparency and an awareness of what companies do. And because there's so many things at the minute where companies have to tick certain boxes to share certain information, but it's not really getting down to the nitty gritty of what's actually happening. And there's a blocker somewhere that needs to be unblocked. Because only through that awareness can you really see the impact of the companies, and only really then are they accountable for the stuff that they're doing behind the scenes. So yeah, removing that barrier that's blocking, I think.
And if you achieve that, then
yeah.
then good on you. And I'm going to be, I'm going to be one absolutely championing and supporting you. It's a really interesting point. Obviously, it's kind of core and fundamentals of the work we do at the Charter, and you know, that whole notion of context and of understanding. We're into a stage now where there's transparency, and then there's transparency. There's transparency in terms of directly, you know, have you provided evidence of substantiation for a particular claim that you're making? Great. Or in particular piece of reporting. but actually it's understanding the wider transparency associated with context and being able to be open and clear on that. If you find that magic bullet, then
I'll let you know.
But Lauren, that was fantastic. Classic me, obliterated 20 minutes on you, but let's move on now. Would you mind possibly summarizing for our listeners the article by Seb Murray in the FT? I think it was November last year. Obviously draws upon some of the themes that we talked about already today, but just provide us with a bit of a summary, and then if possible, just pick out whatever the most interesting or particularly salient points were for you in that piece.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie, but from reading the article, what I got from it is that it was flagging the difference between EU business school curriculum versus US business school curriculum in how they approach sustainability within those business courses. So, from an EU perspective, generally speaking, they will tie sustainability into almost every element of what they're teaching students to do with business, so that essentially they come out of that with a real holistic overview of how sustainability is intertwined in everything that how business operates, versus in the US, where they take probably quite a traditional view on sustainable change, where they position it within a framework of having to create a business case in order to create the sustainable change. So it has to be justified, it has to be commercially savvy. If it's not, it sounds like from the article, it's not that big of a deal. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think you've nailed it, Lauren. Well, we'll certainly link to the piece for our listeners to have a look. I think it was particularly, there were some really interesting suggestions on some particular business schools that I think were doing some fairly innovative things here in the EU. But yes, I think you've nailed it. What really stood out for you in terms of what the piece covered?
There are a few things. So one was how they, in the EU, they treat it as a multidisciplinary approach. Multidisciplined approach. So, and that's something I think that's super important. Like, if a company is to really drive sustainable change, it has to be something that every single department, every single team member is on board with and understands their role in pushing that forward. Otherwise, it feels like, from my experience anyway, it comes into like a tick box thing, something that they have to do to achieve some sort of, be in line with some sort of regulation. But really, that's the company's not focused on achieving that particular goal. So that was a key one. Another one was, I'm going to pronounce this name wrong, Marimekko, Chief Executive Officer. I think he made a really valid point about how it's all well and good business schools teaching their students about sustainable change and how to adapt that into business. It's all well and good having that theory and that understanding, but then actually transitioning that into real corporate world is really hard. I've experienced that myself with the masters and the job that I do now. So then I think there needs to be more support, and I don't know how that is created, but in merging the academic side of things with the practical side of things. So I thought that was an interesting point. And the other thing that I thought was really important that they pulled out was the increased importance put around the social impact side of things. So as I was alluding to earlier, I think quite traditionally, perhaps in corporates, it's all about carbon emissions. How do you reduce your water? How can you increase your renewable energy over fossil fuels? But what's going on behind the scenes, like, from a regenerative approach, when you think about regenerative transitions, companies are much more thinking about holistically every single touch point that's impacted with that change, including the people, the biodiversity, et cetera, and I think an increased awareness of that hopefully will start to happen over the next 10, 20 years, because I think that's been perhaps forgotten about a little bit.
Indeed, the multifaceted nature of the issues at large. I think I couldn't agree with you more that there's almost a a fixation. And I think it actually ties in that point with the first point that you made, which is when you do have a sort of siloed sustainability function, and you're not looking at sort of adopting it or integrating sustainability awareness, if you like, across an entire organization, that can then therefore lend itself to not thinking about all of the issues at play when it comes to sustainability, but focusing on the headlines, if you like, the carbon reductions, etc. So I couldn't agree with you more. I've got loads of questions to throw at you, Lauren, now. So, and I'm going to throw them in no particular order. When it comes to, when you read the piece and you reflected on your own experience at Edinburgh, did it ring true to you that you felt like your course gave you that holistic view, and that perhaps the sort of ruthless corporate analysis, I guess, of the value of sustainability was less prevalent?
Yeah, exactly that. So I remember being sat in seminars and stuff, and I'd be kind of coming at it being like, yeah, it's all well and good talking about this, but like this isn't what actually happens in real life. And there was a bit of a it's a bit of a sticky conversation, because as well, and this is a huge generalization, but I was the only person who was on that course who'd come from a corporate background. And most people on that course either were from an engineering background, so, you know, knew how to create a solar panel or a wind turbine, generally speaking, or had come from like a like geography background, or maybe even biology backgrounds, like quite the sciencey side of things. You know, so they're really interested in people and planet, and like I don't know how to say this without sounding a bit brash, but kind of like it is kind of the really emotional side of it, like the empathetic, caring. I want to say fluffy, but it's not fluffy. It's anything but fluffy. But like it,
idealistic,
maybe idealistic. But the reality is that the corporates are the beasts that need to be tamed, I think, with sustainable transition. And you absolutely need the awareness that a course like that brings you. Like, you need to understand the impact of wind farms in the desert in Mexico, and all the impact that it has on the indigenous communities and the biodiversity. It's so important to have that insight, because it means that you can have deeper conversations with companies when they're going through sustainable transition. But there is a bridge that needs to be created between the two. Because otherwise I think you end up with just two quite conflicting views on what needs to happen. Like, we really care about the people and the planet. We really care about ticking the boxes, but I don't know how you bring the two together.
Do you know what? That I'm so pleased that you've picked that up, because I think when I read the article, that was one of my reflections, was essentially that I want a holistic analysis of the issues at play. I want that complete point, but I certainly don't want the kind of commercial reality to be missed in that.
Yes.
You know, I think when I read that article, it was almost like either we can think about sustainability, and I'm going to use some of your words, you know, in a really nice kind of fluffy, like, isn't this the right thing to do? And aren't we morally on the right side of history? And all of those sorts of nice bits, if you like. Or we can think about it from a practical, pragmatic, you know, we operate in a financial system that operates this way, and we need to come up with a business case for sustainability. Well, I want there to be that mid ground between those two things. And I think it's concerning that there isn't, you know, a sort of a consensus on drawing those two things together from an educational perspective. So I completely agree with you. I think that, yeah, we need to find that mid ground. Optimistic pragmatism, I think.
Yes.
Where it fits.
Yeah.
Let me ask you then, Lauren, I want to move on, because I know, and our listeners will be really interested to hear about the work that, you know, the dissertation that you've worked on, or that you worked on during your master's. Coming back to your first point about, and I'm going to tie this together with it, where you talked about the need for sustainability to be embedded across an entire organization. I want to touch upon the role that leadership can play in enabling that. I actually reflect on one conversation we had with a guy, great guy called Dax Lovegrove, who came on the show a while ago, and he worked in various chief sustainability roles at Sainsbury's and Versace and Jimmy Choo and places like that. And he spoke about the requirement for the sustainability function within organizations to be given a lot of power and a lot of grunt initially, but that ultimately the intention for the sustainability department should be to become not necessarily, completely sort of eradicated, but certainly over time, they go into more of a sort of a background sort of analysis and support function because essentially the embedding has occurred.
Yeah.
Touch upon for me the role that you think leadership plays in ensuring that sustainability initiatives and functions can be embedded across an organization.
Before I do that, can I just ask you a question on was he called Dax? Did he
Dax, yeah.
Did he feel like that that kind of ownership that team would have, that sustainability team would have, the grit that you're kind of talking about, is enabled from a CEO position? Like, how did he say?
Exactly that. Yeah. So he was saying that the CEOs that he had worked with had very much given him the backing, if you like, to say, look, I want you to have the sort of the tools, if you like, that you need in order to make the change. Yeah. And that allowed him to, and Dax had mentioned that he sort of stayed in a lot of his roles for kind of a 2 to 3 year period. On the basis that he was given that sort of backing, he could go and affect the change that needed to be made, and then that allowed him to move on and do something similar in an additional role. Yeah. Obviously, I might be butchering that, so sorry, Dax, if I completely missed our conversation. But yeah, that's kind of how he positioned it, as I recall.
Yeah, well, I mean, that completely aligns with what I found in my research as well. So that's why I just wanted to check. Yeah, so as part of the masters, I had to do a dissertation, and what I wanted to do was to understand within the food and beverage industry, what do senior leaders perceive the barriers and enablers to be to sustainable change? So I interviewed a selection of CEOs, a selection of senior leaders who sit within a variety of different companies within the food and beverage kind of hospitality sector. So that stemmed from right at the beginning of supply chain. So a company that are kind of leading the way from a regenerative farming perspective through to products. So, actual, say, for example, an ice cream brand or a crisp brand or a chocolate brand, through to companies that then actually execute those products in a hospitality sort of sector. All of these companies are huge. Quite a lot of them are international. So very much operating in kind of that corporate space. And I found a few quite interesting things and some things that I wasn't expecting to find as well, which is always the way with research, isn't it? It's quite nice. So a few key things, a few key differences were I was able to split the companies into two types. So regardless of whether it was hospitality or kind of the very beginning of supply chain. And the two types were, do they have a strategy embedded which is about reducing their impact, or do they not? So from a business direction perspective, yes, of course, they're trying to grow and have commercial success, but also kind of underpinning all of that is a consciousness that they want to reduce their impact. So they either did have that or they didn't. And when I was able to split out the responses to the interviews that I conducted, there became two very clear differences in the senior leaders from, we'll call them impact reducing companies and non-impact reducing companies. So and I've made a note here just so I've absolutely got this down right, what I wrote my dissertation, because it was a few months ago when I wrote it. The impact reducing companies perceived their enablers to sustainable change to be internal, so from within the company. So those enablers are things like a collaboration, a holistic approach, having a forward-thinking, future-proofing strategy, so longer-term ambition, and all of that way of working together allows them to be able to create a sustainable transition. versus the non-impact reducing companies who perceived their enablers to be external from their company. So for them to have a sustainable transition, they need the consumer to be demanding that. They need the policy and the regulation to be in place for them to be essentially their hand to be forced, for them to change their processes to achieve that transition. When we look at the barriers, again, there was two really consistent themes. So the impact reducing companies, their blockers, they perceived to be external. So for them, their blockers were consumer demand, and another blocker for them was innovation. So, you know, from a packaging perspective or a product innovation perspective, is there something that hasn't yet been developed yet, which allows them to do the sustainable transition? Versus the non-impact reducing companies who stated that their blockers were internal. So for them, their blockers were the fact that quite often a sustainable initiative was led from the bottom up. So they didn't have that kind of, or they had short-term goals that was led from the CEO. And those sorts of ways of thinking blocked them from doing the sustainable transition. So there ended up being these really clear differences.
And Lauren, as you were describing that, I was just reflecting back on the experiences that you shared with us earlier, and it's direct to life. It's literally you lived the case example that bores that out. Out of interest, when you spoke to and you categorized the companies as you say being that impact led and those that aren't, like what was the justification from the CEOs as to why they were one or the other?
Well, I think it then comes down to the last question that I asked them all.
Yeah.
So I kind of threw this in on a whim on the first interview, and I got a really interesting response. So it became like a standardized question that I asked everybody.
Okay.
And the question was, what do you want your legacy to be? How do you want people to remember you? And it was fascinating what they said. So the impact reducing companies, their legacy was long-term. It was, I want to create a change in an industry that is there way before I'm gone. I want to impact globally people in this sort of scenario, la, la, la. Non-impact reducing companies, what do you want your legacy to be? I want people to think I want people to remember me as. I want people, and it was so inward focused about themselves. So I think one key thing that ultimately enables a company to either create sustainable change, reduce their impact or not, comes down to the individual person who is sitting in that top tier position that is able to make those decisions and their key characteristics as a person. So are they empathetic? Do they think about more people other than themselves, to be blunt? Do they see importance in that or not? I think it's as easy as that. Because if people want to make the change, they'll make the change.
Yeah.
They'll find a way. And there was one CEO in particular who is head of a leading hospitality company. They do incredible things. Everyone will have experienced what they offer in some way or another, for sure. And he went into that company about 7 years ago, and he just was like, this is not right. And he just did all he could to change it. And he's created an incredible business now off the back of it. And it's only because he went into that role. Someone went into that role who didn't have the same characteristics as he does, that wouldn't be the case now.
Do you know what this is? You describing this is made me both terrified and incredibly hopeful at the same time. It's almost, and I know you're not saying this, I know there's more nuance, I know there's more factors to
of course,
effect. I appreciate that, but for it to have, but you're, the way you've positioned it, it is so compelling that the person that is leading these organizations and their outlook and their view of themselves and their legacy and what impact they're hoping to have can have such a dramatic effect upon the direction that obviously that company then chooses to take. it fills me with, as I say, slight fear that thing that it can be affected to such a degree, but also hopeful that, if we can develop that more empathetic leader, if you like, then we've got a chance here, because this is the way, as you've alluded to with that example, that change can occur from within. Not just be sort of subjected to external factors, as you alluded to before. What was your overarching feeling when you got to the end of your dissertation, you reflected upon what you learned? Like, how did you feel about what you had learned?
Particularly when I came off, it was more when I came off specific interviews with senior leaders, CEOs in impact reducing companies. I felt like such relief, to be honest, because I feel up until now, and including where I am now, I haven't ever worked in organizations which puts people and planet as like a key factor in the business strategy. And I was able to have conversations with these senior leaders, very successful senior leaders who have built strategies that includes that consideration. And it was like, oh, thank God they exist. Like, I just didn't even think they existed. And also to meet people who, through the examples that I shared earlier, I've come across blockers that have made me feel like the way I think about the world isn't right. And I need to adjust my views and opinions on things because, if so-and-so who's in a super senior role says that I need to time out or that I'm doing the wrong thing, then, I must be doing the wrong thing. And then actually to have a conversation with somebody who thinks exactly the same way as I do was just the best thing. So yeah, I felt very optimistic coming off the call, to be honest, particularly because those organizations were very successful. So it's possible.
And Lauren, I know we've obliterated our timings on this, and I hope it's okay if I keep asking you questions. It's fascinating. That point there, these businesses, these impact reducing businesses have been super successful.
Yeah.
Were there any examples from within your conversations with CEOs where really difficult decisions had been made by that leader to potentially forego in the short term those standard metrics of success, those things that ultimately, if these are public limited companies, these are requirements for them to look to optimize shareholder value? Yeah. Were there examples of where the difficult decisions have been made? Because the one devil's advocate point I draw to with this is that if having a long-term view and being a sustainable brand and business and position can be justified in terms of realizing a greater return through brand recognition and brand strength and position within the market, it all fits really nicely together. You can say, well, being a sustainable business is being a successful business, and we can rejoice in the fact that we made those decisions. I'm interested in those sort of examples of where you hear people making difficult decisions that perhaps aren't short-term commercially the right thing to do, but they are longer-term the right thing to do to be a more sustainable entity. Were there any examples of that during the conversations that you had?
We didn't talk about any specific examples with companies that I think would answer that question directly, but I think there was a question that I asked everybody, which I gave them 4 words, which were CEO, education / awareness, policy / regulation, or cost. And I asked them to order those 4 words in terms of importance of or power that they have in driving change.
Okay.
One thing that was consistent with the impact reducing companies, cost was not even considered a factor. So it was irrelevant to the sustainable change, because the other and more often than not, education sat at the top. So ensuring everyone was aware of what they were, not only the impact they were having on the business, but what the business was trying to achieve and why it was trying to achieve it. Created some really strong focus in the business, and they were able to do it. But I think, to your point, right, it's a question about commerciality of a business. Is it achievable? What was really interesting is that the cost didn't even come into play for them as a factor. So I'm sure there has been lots of all of these companies who I spoke to, these CEOs have been in positions for a long period of time, from before COVID and after COVID. They're products that, particularly hospitality industry, relies on us not being in lockdown to thrive. And yet those businesses have soared and have absolutely bounced back post the return of COVID. So yeah, I'm sure they do have lots of examples of where they have been in sticky situations, but they've got some really strong values there that I think allow them to work through it.
And that is brilliant to hear, that framing, if you like, of the issues allows them to prioritize other things other than simply that. Are we going to be sustainable, or are we going to be profitable? There's more consideration than that.
Yeah.
Lauren, it's been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to have to conclude though now with the magic wand question. So, and I'm really intrigued to hear what you're going to go for with our magic wand. But Lauren, if I was to hand you our magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Well, I think based on what we've just said, it's to make sure that all key decision makers in organizations, whatever position that is, are empathetic human beings. I think that would be it.
Here. I love a simple magic wand. I think and especially being drawn out of your research as well. It's a great suggestion. And we have some magic wand suggestions that I think that I'm not poo-pooing them, but they're very ambitious, perhaps at times overly ambitious. But I think that notion of empathetic leadership, I think, that seems like something that hopefully our collective consciousness can facilitate and support as things begin to evolve and change around the world. Lauren, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us this morning. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Hope you did too.
Thank you for having me, Charlie.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Lauren Wilkinson for sharing her experience, expertise, and her research. Lauren's insights brought depth to our discussion on the Financial Times article exploring the transatlantic divide in ESG education and the role of business schools in shaping tomorrow's responsible leaders. This episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing ethical and sustainable corporate communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for tuning in. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.